Hey folks, welcome to this introductory series on getting set up and running with Percolate. If you've not come across Percolate up until now, Percolate is an agentic orchestrator inside a database. And this is a database that has 5 query modalities for relational data, vector embeddings, graph relationships, key value lookups, and also REST queries. Then I'm going to show you how to get set up and running in just a few minutes using Docker Compose to create your own local Percolate database instance, populate it with some test data, create your own agents and your own agentic workflows. Because Percolate, being a data tier agentic orchestrator, is a little bit different to some of the agentic frameworks you may have used in the past, I'll also spend just a few minutes outlining some of the main concepts. And then as we go through some of the examples, some of these ideas will sink into place. So with that said, let's go over and take a look at the repo and get things installed. I've added a link to the repo in the description. You'll see in the about here, it's described an agentic orchestrator inside a relational vector graph key value database. It's got an MIT license. And if you scroll down in the README, you'll see that there are some resources, including a link to the docs. And we're going to use these docs now to get things installed. You're going to need to have Docker Desktop or Docker installed on your machine and Poetry. And we'll be able to use Docker Compose up to actually initialize the database. Now let's just take a quick look at the Docker Compose file. What we're particularly interested in is the Postgres service in here. It uses the Percolation Labs Docker image, and the credentials to log into the database will be Postgres and Postgres. So if you've cloned the code, you can Docker Compose up, as in the docs, and it'll just take a few seconds to spin up, and then you can log in with the credentials I just mentioned. And you'll notice there are a few schema added here. There's the Percolate graph, some embeddings schema, and the P8 schema, which is where we put most of the bits that you'll need. So at this point, I think congratulations are in order, because even if you got no deeper into Percolate, you now have a Dockerized Postgres extension, which very conveniently packs in a bunch of very useful Postgres extensions. You can use pgvector to add vector embeddings and query them. You can use the AGE graph extension to add entities and relationships and query those with Cypher. And you can use the HTTP extension to call out to language models and tools from the database, which of course you should do with some care. And these are all very useful modalities for working with agentic systems. So let's take a moment just to break down why that is. So Postgres, of course, is a relational database, so that's our foundation. And relational data can be very interesting for natural language to SQL type queries and analytical type questions. But when building RAG systems more generally, of course, vector embeddings are one of the modalities that have had the most attention, certainly since the early days of agentic systems. And then graph is the next thing people started to think a lot about to get over the limitations of vector embeddings, but just more generally, it's very interesting to think about how to build knowledge graphs and how to query over knowledge graphs. And then we add key value. Key value is a very interesting modality when you want to look up entities. By key, it's less sophisticated than doing sort of SQL queries or embedding queries, but it's very powerful. And then finally, we have the HTTP REST type queries. And we've added this into the database as well, so you can actually call APIs and tools. So I'd encourage you to go check out that local Dockerized Postgres instance so you can play around with the different query modalities. I've left a link in the description which explains at a high level how Percolate uses these different query modalities, but this applies in general to working with agentic systems. So let's take a look now at the data catalog in Percolate, which is how we orchestrate the agentic workflows from the data tier. So the first is the language model APIs. We store the information for these language models in the database so that we can call them from the database or from the Python client. And there are 3 schemes that we need to implement here. There's the OpenAI scheme, which you could say is a de facto standard. And then you have the Anthropic and Google schemes. Then you have the tools registry. We store all the information about tools as sort of OpenAPI specification. This represents either native database functions or REST APIs. And each of these are used for planning, searching, and calling tools. And then we have the agent manifest. Remember that an agent is made up of exactly 3 things. Firstly, there's the system prompt. Secondly, there's the structured output, which is JSON schema or Pydantic, perhaps. Then you have the tools, which are those same tools that we have registered in the database for calling. And then finally, we have the session audit. When the user or client calls the language model via Percolate, the language model responds possibly with a tool call or multiple tool calls. So we make that tool call and we store the response in the database. Now, each one of these is what we call a turn. This is a sort of a transaction, request response, and a tool evaluation. We store this in the database. So we're over here in the README again, where we left off after doing the Docker Compose up. And there's a client here where we can initialize the Percolate database with some sample data and some environment, some tokens from our environment and so on. Right. So if we cd into the client's Python Percolate directory and we take a look at what's in here, we can see it's a poetry project. So, if you're doing this for the first time, you can poetry install the dependencies, but I've done that already. So I'm just going to run the command poetry run p8 init. Now what this is going to do is going to add any tokens or any environment variables that we've set for the tokens that are in our language model API table. Right, so you can see some examples here. And the other thing this does is it indexes the code base. You can see that just below here to add in some sample documents, and it also adds the Swagger test API. We'll get back to that. So we're back here in the Postgres database. I'm using pgadmin4, by the way, as my client. And if you recall, there are these schema that were created earlier. And all we've done now is we've populated some of these tables with some new data. Right. And if you have a look here at some of these tables, a lot of these are the Percolate catalog that we were talking about, right? The AI response, the agent, and this API proxy and function are for storing the tool registry and any associated APIs. We have the language model API, and a lot of these aren't so important right now. We also have the session, the user session for the question they're asking with whatever system prompt. So if we take a look at the language model API, there are a bunch of sample models in here, right, that I've just been using for testing. And you can see that they follow a particular scheme. A lot of them are OpenAI scheme. There's the completion endpoint. And then there are these tokens. Those are the ones that we've just synced in from our environment. Okay. So now that we've done that, we have everything set up. So we're ready just to start testing. So we can use Percolate function here to ask a sort of a ping, a simple real-world knowledge question, such as what is the capital of Ireland? The default model is GPT, by the way, and GPT says the capital of Ireland is Dublin. Okay, so this just proves that things are hooked up. We can also use those documents that we indexed to ask what is Percolate, and it'll give a description of Percolate. And this uses a combination of the Python files, README files, and SQL files that are in our repo. Okay, so those are some just basic checks. And what we can do is we can take a look at the functions that were registered as well. When we ran that init function, if you remember, I said there was a test Swagger API that was added. And we already have some native functions in here like help and search. We can talk about those again another time. But what I want to focus on for today's demo is just to show you that we have this get pet find by status, which came in from that test Swagger endpoint. And we're going to use that in one of our agents in a moment. And you can see here that the API is registered. There's the test Swagger API, and also there's this sort of built-in Percolate API that we use for admin and indexing and things like that. Okay, and you can add your own APIs, of course. So we'll use the getting started with Python guide because we're going to create a test agent now. And this agent, you can see here that we subclass Pydantic base model. So anything that subclasses base model is an agent. And you can see the system prompt here is the doc string. And we also have some fields which make up a structured response. There's an embedding on one of those fields. And then there are these functions that we register, right? And there's the get pet find by status function that we want to reference here in our agent. Now, although we won't get into it today, you can just run this using the Percolate Python client. But what we want to focus on today is registering this agent in the database so that we can use it from the database. So if we have a look at the agents table, there are a bunch of agents in here, but the one we care about is this my first agent, and the rest are just the sort of built-in agents from the different tables. Every table is an agent in Percolate, actually. You can see the system prompt here for that agent, and you can also see, if you scroll across here, we've got the JSON schema, and also somewhere here we'll be able to see the functions that were added to those agents, right? So here's that get find by status function, which belongs to this agent. So we have all that metadata in the database now. So if we use another function here, which is percolate with agent, we can ask a question of that agent, right? So we're going to ask, find some pets that are sold, right? And we'll use my first agent as the agent context. What this does is it uses the function, it realizes it needs to call that function, and it knows from the metadata that it can pass this sold parameter and how to pass that parameter. And as we mentioned before, these turns are actually including the evaluation as well. The database is actually called the API, so we have this turn object which includes the response, the data. Right? If you scroll across, you can see that there's a session ID, and then the status is tool call response. Now, if we take that session ID, we can illustrate something here, which is this idea of resuming a session. Right? Now, we're just doing this for test purposes now. We'll show you another way to do this in a moment. But if we resume this session, it'll pick up where it left off, and it will send the data, and then it will ask the language model to sort of provide the final answer. Right? So this is a much more succinct answer for the user. You'll notice here as well that it adds this random fact, because the prompt asked for random fact, which is just a little sort of a test hack to make sure it's using the system prompt. So the next thing we can do then is we can illustrate how we can actually run an iteration or a sequence of these turns, right? So rather than just stopping at the tool call response, we sort of run to completion. What we're going to do here is we're going to add, actually as the second parameter, the maximum number of turns. Grok2 latest will be the model we're using, and my first agent will be the agent that we're going to use for this context. So we can run that, and essentially it does just what those two queries above did, but as one sort of iterative sequence. We have the response. So that's it for today. I hope at this point you've been able to launch the local Dockerized Postgres instance. You've got some idea about what Percolate is as a data tier agentic orchestrator. Of course, we've only touched the surface, so stay in touch via the various channels linked in the README, in the repo. And of course, subscribe below to get more tutorials and walkthroughs as we use Percolate to explore the world of language models and agentic workflows.